Well, we're getting towards the end of the new features in Simplify3D version 4, and I would imagine that there'll probably be this video and probably one more video to finish it off. There's well, you'll see. So let's get on with this video and see what we're looking at today. So here we are back on the Simplify3D's website showing what's new in version 4, and if you probably would have guessed already that we're going to be covering some of the new bridging features in version 4. So we're down more or less at the bottom of this page now in the other popular requests section, and there are two items here which relate to bridging, and both of which we're going to cover today. So the first one on the left here is called Bridging Perimeter Options, and rather than read out what they've put here, which is not exactly it doesn't give you the exact idea of what's going on, I will show you. Bridging angle selection is a little bit more accurate to what it does, but in both cases we're going to run through these now in version 3 and version 4 of Simplify3D. So here we are in version 3, and I've created this little model which is going to give me the best chance of demonstrating what has changed between version 3 and version 4 for bridging. As you can see, there are some sort of normal bridges going on here which gradually get longer and longer. I think we go from a 20mm bridge here to a 60mm bridge there, which for the purpose of this video should be adequate. One thing you will probably notice is that these bridges are quite wide, and I've noticed that in certainly these sort of temperature towers, a lot of the times there isn't actually enough material for the specific bridging options in Simplify3D to kick in. And I will show you why. If we open up the process settings and go into Other, which is where the bridging options are specified in version 3, down in the bottom right here, you can see the first option is the Unsupported Error Threshold, which is 50 square mil, which means that any options you set here will only actually take effect if that area is unsupported for at least 50 square mil. Now, the case with a lot of these sort of specifically temperature towers, which you'd probably be tempted to start trying some bridging options on there as well, don't actually come into the 50 square mil bracket, so you can fiddle around with those options as much as you like. They aren't going to do anything. So if we turn this part upside down, which we can by doing this, and look at it from underneath, if I get it at the right angle, you'll see there are also cutaways here underneath, which will let me demonstrate the differences in bridging angles. So let's pop open the process settings again, and this is a completely standard one of my processes. I haven't modified anything, and if we go into the other again, these are the default settings in version 3 for bridging. So let's OK that and do a prepare to print. If we make sure that the colouring is set to feature type, we can scroll back down through the print and we will get to the yellow, which is bridging. So these yellow parts here are where those bridging settings are taking effect. So if you run through your print and you don't see any yellow, it means that those bridging settings are being ignored essentially. The first thing I noticed when I started doing some bridging and playing around with those bridging settings in version 3 as it was, is that the bridging settings only apply to the sort of inner fill areas. As you can see on these spars here, the actual outer perimeter and inner perimeter are not yellow, which means that they are not taking on any of those specific bridging settings. It is only actually the sort of infill parts here which are yellow, which is taking on those settings, which I found a little bit mysterious because obviously this whole thing is a bridge. So you would think that you would want to apply the settings to the perimeters, outer and inner, and not just the infill areas. You can also see that in version 3 by default, Simplify3D takes it upon itself to decide which angle is best for these bridging infills. And it's not all the same on the same layer. As you can see, the spars have been done, whichever way you look at it, let's move it around like this, horizontally, whereas each of these sections here have slightly different angles for the infill. In version 3, as opposed to version 4, which we'll look at in a minute, you have no control over the angle of these bridging infills. So let's have a look at what the defaults look like now in version 4. So here we are with the same part in version 4, and let's open up the process settings and go into the other tab, which is where the settings remain in version 4. The speeds have been separated off into their own tab. So now bridging takes front and center stage as the first block of options here on the top left. Now let's open up version 3 settings side by side so we can have a look at the two together. And if we go through them from top to bottom, the unsupported area threshold remains the same, the extra inflation distance remains the same, the bridging extrusion multiplier remains the same, as does the bridging speed multiplier. So in fact all these settings are exactly the same. What's new in version 4 in terms of settings is that we have this used a fixed bridging infill angle, which I think you can probably guess from its name what that does, and apply bridging settings to perimeters, which is also fairly self-explanatory. But before we do any of that, let's have a look what or how version 4 deals with bridging by default, i.e. with these two off and these settings here set the same as version 3. So let's OK that and open up the print preview. Let's rotate it around a bit, zoom in a bit, and change this to layers. Let's zoom in to the bridging, and as you can see, there are some significant differences without actually changing any settings in version 4. So the most obvious change really is that for these bridging areas here, it has decided to change the angle of the bridging infill to probably better fit these sort of spars here. Now, I don't know why, what is that, 4 out of the 5 of them are in this angle and 1 of them is in this angle, because these are the same width. So I don't really know how it's come to that decision, but anyway. You can see it's also changed the angle of these, which it has done before. Now the other difference that you'll notice is that in fact this area here, which is technically a bridge and was definitely a bridge in version 3, is now not being treated as a bridge, and that is because, I don't know why, but in version 4 this drops just below that 50 square mil threshold, so it is not being treated as a bridge. So we'll fix that a sec by going into the process settings and changing the unsupported area threshold to, let's say, 45 square mil. Prepared to print again. Let's go back down to that area, and now you can see that that has fallen into the 45 square mil threshold and is now being treated as a bridge. So that is always worth noting, you know, checking out if you are expecting bridging settings to kick in, that you are actually getting those settings. So the important part to note here really is that even without any of the additional settings or making any changes whatsoever, Simplify3D has changed the way that they handle bridging, and for the better, because this is probably going to fill these bridges in better than doing them all horizontally as it was doing before. Well, horizontally if we look at it from this angle here. So let's now pop out and have a look to see what we can do with these new settings. So if we open up the process settings again, go into the other tab, find the bridging. We've got these two new options down below. Now I'm not gonna, we're gonna skip over this one for a second and go to the second one here, apply bridging settings to perimeters. And the reason why I'm going to do that one first is if we pop back to their website, the first thing that they promote here is this bridging perimeter options, which when you read it sounds like there's a whole load of additional options for the perimeters, while in reality, if we go back in here, what it is a tick box to allow you to set these settings also to the perimeters and not just the infill. If I'm not making any sense, let's have a quick look at exactly what that does by doing the prepare to print, going back to where the bridging happens, and you can see exactly what has happened. Rather than the bridging settings that you created applying only to the infill, it is also now applying those to the perimeters, which is kind of how I thought it would work in the first place, all the way back in version 3. but now it does, as long as you select that checkbox. So hopefully that should improve, the performance of these bridges on the outside. But we'll test that with some test prints shortly. So let's take a look at the other new option here, and let's go in, find it. Now I'm going to turn off that because these two really, depending on your print, may not mix very well together. So let's apply this other new option here, which is used fixed bridging infill angle. I'm going to change this to, let's say, 210, as I know that that will probably work better for this print. And what we're doing is we are looking at the second one of their new features for bridging, and that is the angle selection. So basically what it allows you to do is to take control of the angle in which the bridging is printed. So going back in, let's OK that and go to prepare print. Let's scroll back down through, and there you go. As you can see, now all of the bridging is at an angle of 210 degrees. And yeah, to be honest with you, that may or may not work better for your print. It's something you're going to need to decide for each print. 210 degrees works quite well here for me, because now this middle spar, which did have the sort of lateral horizontal bridging before, now has the same infill as the rest, and it's the same over here. So what happens if we use both of those options at the same time? Well, let's try it. Let's tick that back on, go into prepare print, go back down so we can see the options here, and rather intelligently it has not done the whole bridge in this motion here, which obviously just wouldn't work. There would be nothing for this sort of wiggly infill to cling to on the outside. So it has produced still usable outer perimeter bridges whilst also still following our desired infill angle. So that's all good. I'm now going to run off a few prints. We're going to run off one from version 3 with the default settings. I will run off one from this one, version 4, with its default settings. So let's turn those off. Go into prepare print and remind ourselves about what that's going to do. So the main difference here is going to be the fact that it's choosing more wisely the infill angles for the infill. At least that's the difference over version 3. I will then run a separate print where we apply these bridging settings to the outer perimeters, and finally I will run a test print using both of the new features, i.e. using the bridging options for the perimeters as well as a fixed angle, and we will have a look what the differences are between all those. Right, so the prints are finished. I've got 4 copies of the same part, one of them printed in version 3 with the default bridge settings, one of them printed in version 4 with the default bridge settings. The other 2 are both in version 4. One of them has the include the perimeters option ticked, and the last one has the include perimeter options ticked, as well as the specify an angle, which is specified at 210 degrees. So right off the bat, yeah, there's no massively obvious differences between any of these really. So at best we're looking at minor improvements, which is probably understandable given what we're attempting to do here, especially on the sort of long 60mm free space runs. You wouldn't expect miracles. So looking at version 3 here and the version 4 here, both done with default settings. If we go straight in and look at the 60mm run, you can indeed see an improvement. Maybe there is a slight improvement. Version 3 is the one on top here, and version 4 is underneath it, and you can see that on that 60mm run bridge rather, you can see that the version 4 one is a bit cleaner. It's managed to keep the droop of the filament to less than V3, but it's not a magic wand. Looking at the other end of the spectrum, we've got the 20mm gap, and I would say that although it probably doesn't come out particularly well on camera, there is a visible improvement between V3 and V4. V3 has a very sort of mild amount of sag, and V4 basically has none that you can see. So somewhere in the middle, I would say that the V3 print on the, and I'll see if I can get that so you can see it, probably not. V3 on the 30mm run has a sort of reasonable amount of sag in there, and V4, if you can see, is a definite improvement. Let me see if I can hold those up so you can actually see both at the same time. Let's move these out of the way. So yeah, there you go. Possibly you can see that version 3 up here has quite a bit more sag than version 4 down here. The same is probably true on the 40mm and to a lesser degree on the 50mm. So what we're seeing is a sort of diminishing returns as the bridges get longer and longer. But it is a significant improvement in bridging terms. You know, that's a good improvement. Any improvement in you know, keeping the filament where it's supposed to be is good news, especially in bridging. So that was the default settings, and let's have a look to see what differences we're seeing with version 4 default settings and version 4 with when you select the option to include the perimeters in the bridging settings. So we're not really going to see a whole lot of difference, and if we look at the 60mm run, again it is a sort of slight improvement possibly. There is no, whereas in the sort of default settings on version 4 you can see a slight bit of separation on the layers. In version 4 with the perimeters option set, you can't. Now that may have been just luck of the draw in that particular print. Who knows? The actual sag looks possibly slightly better in the bottom one with the perimeter options on. So let's have a look at the 20mm span, and effectively they are both the same. It was already pretty good with the default settings in version 4. Let's see if we can have a look at the 20mm. Let me see if I can hold this up so we can see the gap. Now I would say to my eye they are pretty much the same, although the one with the perimeters on, no, the one with the perimeters on definitely is showing a slightly less sag that you can probably, if I can hold this in one end, which is not going to be easy, you can probably see slightly less sag on this second spar than you can on that second spar up. And the same is probably true of 40, 50, but again it's diminishing returns. So let's compare let's compare the first version 4, this one that we've already looked at, with version 4 with the same perimeters option checkbox ticked, but also the specifying the infill angle at 210 degrees. So there isn't really a whole lot of difference you can see in the bridging, which would be to be expected really, because we're not really improving much here. What we're doing is aligning the bridging more probably for aesthetic purposes, or aligning the sort of angle of the infill. If we turn them upside down, we can see you know, what it's tried to do in this one, which was the one without the angle specified. If you remember in our print preview, the middle bridge here was the one that had top to bottom, looking at this, or as we looked at it in the preview, left to right, had the straight infills, whereas the other ones had the sort of wiggly left to right infills. With the infill angles fixed at 210 degrees, you can see that they've all got their wiggly infills, and that should be at 210 degrees. Which really I don't think is going to make a lot of difference. What it does do, as far as I can see, and I should be able to see if I hold this up correctly to the light, you can see at the top there's a lot more drooping on that infill on the top one, where we've tried to force the infill to be, you know, to go up and down or left and right rather than straight across the bridge. So I would say that limited use cases really. In fact, it would probably be better, I would say, to have set the bridging for this part, for these, you know, open bridges here, so that it did run directly up and down, because that seems to have produced, you know, less droop in the bridge infill. But really more importantly, I guess, is these sections here, and this is going to be really tricky to hold up because they're sort of sunk in. Let me see. Can you see that? Yeah, maybe just. So on the left, I need to look at it. Yeah, on the left is the one where I fixed the infill angle to 210 degrees. So you can see that each one of those four holes, essentially, in the one on the left, the infill that you can see at the top is all pointing in the same direction. Hopefully that's still focusing. Yeah, that's better. Whereas on the right, where we didn't specify, it's obviously going in all sorts of different directions. Now, I'm not sure whether, you know, people are going to use that in order to try and get better actual bridging performance, or where if their bridges are very close to the top of the part, and that bridging, you know, the pattern of the bridging becomes visible to the outside of the part, then that's probably where it may be more beneficial. However, you can use it if you think you know better than Simplify3D to force the infill bridging angle. So that's essentially all of the parts and my findings. If we compare V3 with the final print in V4, I don't. That's probably not the best comparison. In my mind, the best actual bridging that I got was without my forced angle, leaving Simplify3D to do the angles itself. Yeah, you can see that really even on the 60mm one, there's a considerable improvement between version 3 and version 4 with the you know, options set. On the, well, we know there's no point in looking at the 20mm because we know that's already good, but if I hold this up such that we can sort of see maybe the difference between the 20mm, you can see on the top part here that sorry, 30mm section, the second one up here, has got a much bigger sag than the version 4 print with the perimeters set to bridging options. The 40mm, yeah, is an improvement, but really we're still seeing sagging as we do with 50mm and 60mm. And yeah, there we go. I should point out really that as is the case with all of these videos really on the new features in version 4, is that I'm not trying to show you the ultimately best bridging that you can do. Far from it. I've just literally haven't played with any other settings. The point is to show the differences between version 3 and version 4, and to do the comparison. It's, you know, the same printer, the same filament, all the other settings are the same, except I'm just using the new features in version 4. So I'm sure you can get better bridging than that if you play around with it as you would if you're doing it seriously. The point is that the base point in version 4 is seemingly better, and I would say in this case it sort of takes it from a sort of more or less sag-free 20mm bridge in my case, and turned that into, you know, probably an even better 30mm bridge. So yeah, it's a relative thing. You can do better for sure, but that's not the point of these videos. We're not doing a bridging video, we're doing what's new in version 4 of Simplify3D. So yeah, I think there's probably going to be one more video to come to cover the couple of features that are left, and we'll get to that very shortly.